No one expected a quiet middle school teacher to become the center of the most explosive trial Maple County had ever seen. What started as a routine stop spiraled into a courtroom showdown that shattered reputations, exposed buried secrets, and flipped the power dynamic upside down. As lies unraveled and hidden truths emerged, the people of Maple County were left asking themselves one question: who was Ruth Whitaker? And why did a decorated officer fear the truth she carried? The morning sun poured through the tall windows of the Maple County Courthouse, casting warm streaks of light across the scuffed wooden floor. The room itself was steeped in history, from the worn benches to the faded portraits of long-past judges lining the walls. In this small Georgia town, court wasn't just a legal process, it was a public spectacle, where the curious, the concerned, and the judgmental all gathered to watch justice unfold or unravel. The benches were packed. Older couples in their Sunday best whispered quietly, swapping theories. Local reporters sat poised, pens tapping against notepads, waiting to capture every word. A row of off-duty officers leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, a silent show of support for Officer Blake Hendricks, whose word for years had been law in this town. At the center of it all, seated at the defense table, was Ruth Whitaker, a soft-spoken, 58-year-old middle school teacher. With her hands gently clasped, her back straight, and her chin lifted just so, Ruth exuded the quiet dignity of a woman who had spent her life teaching respect and demanding it in return. Her graying hair was neatly pulled back, her floral blouse freshly pressed, but there was something unshakable beneath her calm exterior, a weight in her eyes, a quiet strength that set her apart. The whispers faded as Judge Earl Whitmore entered. The gavel struck, and so began a case that would leave a town divided, a courtroom stunned, and a corrupt officer exposed. The low murmur of shifting bodies filled the courtroom as the first witness was called. Officer Blake Hendricks, a man many in Maple County knew well, stepped confidently to the stand. His uniform was spotless, every button gleaming under the courthouse lights. His swaggering stride carried the air of a man who knew how this would play out, a man who'd been here before and always walked away unscathed. Hendricks wasn't just any officer in Maple County. For years he'd been a fixture at high school football games, parades and community barbecues, shaking hands, sharing smiles, always the friendly face of law enforcement. That was the man the townsfolk thought they knew. But the man who sat down in the witness box wore a different face. The face of someone who had no doubt the jury would believe his every word. In a steady, almost rehearsed voice, Hendricks described the night in question. According to him, it was a routine patrol, nothing out of the ordinary. He'd seen a suspicious vehicle parked outside a closed hardware store, a woman loitering beside it. When he approached, she immediately grew defensive, refusing to identify herself, raising her voice, and stepping toward him in what he claimed was an aggressive manner. The words came easily, delivered with just the right mix of authority and faux regret, the well-practiced language of a man who'd written plenty of reports to cover himself before. He claimed Ruth Whitaker shoved him, and in a shocking escalation, reached for his duty belt, coming dangerously close to his firearm. Hendricks painted her as hostile, unpredictable, and physically threatening. From the defense table, Ruth sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her expression didn't change. No outrage, no shock, not even a furrowed brow. She listened, her calm presence an unsettling contrast to Hendricks' increasingly dramatic tale. As the officer continued, the subtle undercurrent of racial bias seeped through his words. He didn't say it directly. He didn't have to. Phrases like that type of attitude, and she acted like she didn't belong there, were more than enough to plant seeds in certain minds on the jury, feeding into old familiar stereotypes. Hendricks spoke with the confidence of a man who assumed his word carried more weight than hers. After all, who would believe a black schoolteacher over a white officer with 15 years on the force? He glanced toward the jury, certain they saw things his way. In his mind, this case was already won. But Ruth wasn't just sitting still. Behind those steady hands and that quiet gaze, she was cataloguing every lie, every exaggerated detail, every crack in the story. Hendricks was weaving. The truth was already pushing at the edges, and before long it would come crashing through. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint scratching of pens against notepads. Officer Hendricks had stepped down from the stand, returning to his seat with the self-satisfied smirk of a man convinced he had just sealed the case in his favor. From the jury box, a few members gave subtle nods, small gestures that hinted they were already leaning toward the version of events Hendricks had fed them. Then, Ruth Whitaker stood. She moved slowly, deliberately, like someone who understood the weight of the moment. There was no outward flash of defiance, no raised voice, no dramatic gestures, just a woman, a schoolteacher, a daughter, a mother, standing tall in the face of accusation. She walked to the witness stand, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood railing. Her floral blouse, so unassuming, seemed out of place in a seat where she was expected to beg for her freedom. But Ruth wasn't about to beg. The prosecutor, Nathan Caldwell, stood to question her, his posture relaxed, almost casual, as if this was a formality. In his eyes, Ruth was just a nervous woman with no criminal history, desperate to explain away a mistake. His tone, polite but condescending, barely masked his belief that this would be over quickly. "Mrs. Whitaker," he began, smiling the way a man smiles when he thinks he already knows the answers, "would you care to explain why you were loitering outside Ray's Hardware after dark?" Ruth didn't flinch. "I wasn't loitering," she replied, her voice smooth, steady, and clear. "I was checking my phone. I had just left my friend's house and needed to double-check the turnoff back to my home." Her calmness was almost unnerving. No stammering, no hesitation. Just facts, delivered without fear. The prosecutor frowned slightly, sensing the first crack in the narrative he'd been handed. "And when Officer Hendricks approached you, did you refuse to identify yourself?" Ruth's gaze didn't waver. "I asked why he needed my ID," she said. "I hadn't broken any laws. I was standing on a public sidewalk, minding my business." The jury shifted in their seats, the first flicker of uncertainty crossing a few faces. "And did you become aggressive?" Caldwell pressed. Ruth's hands folded gently in her lap. "No, sir," she said firmly. "I stood my ground. I have that right." It was a simple answer, but the weight behind it hung in the air, pressing down on the room. For the first time, Officer Hendricks' confidence faltered. The script he'd counted on wasn't playing out the way he expected. Ruth wasn't there to defend herself. She was there to tell the truth, and everyone in the room was starting to feel it. The tension in the courtroom grew thicker with each passing second. Ruth's quiet composure had unsettled not only the prosecutor, but also several jurors who were now leaning forward, paying closer attention than before. This wasn't going the way Officer Hendricks expected. His story was supposed to be the only version they heard, the only version they believed. But Ruth's unwavering calm had cracked something open, and the first sign that this case was not so simple was about to explode into the room. As Ruth returned to her seat, her attorney, David Ramirez, stood up. His hands shook slightly, but his voice carried a quiet determination. He was young, inexperienced, but somewhere between Ruth's confidence and Hendricks' smugness, something inside him had started to sharpen, a sense that they were standing on the edge of something much bigger than one trial. "Your Honor," David said, holding up a small USB drive, "the defense has newly obtained evidence we would like to submit into the record." The prosecutor's head snapped up. "Objection. The defense is required to submit all evidence before trial." Judge Whitmore, who had been silently watching the shift in tone, lifted a hand. "I'll allow it. Let's see what you've got, Mr. Ramirez." The bailiff took the USB and inserted it into the courtroom's aging display system. The screen flickered for a moment before a grainy cell phone video filled the frame, taken from a parked car across the street. The room fell silent. There, in shaky but undeniably clear footage, stood Officer Hendricks, gripping Ruth's arm before she had even finished asking why she was being stopped. The video caught the exact moment he shoved her against the hood of his patrol car, not because she was resisting, but because she had the audacity to question his authority. Then came the words, loud enough for everyone to hear, "People like you don't belong out here after dark." The courtroom gasped. The words hung heavy in the air, echoing long after the video ended. People like you. Nobody needed that explained. Not in a town like Maple County, not with the history everyone knew but rarely spoke about. Hendricks shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, his fingers twitching against the table. The mask of confidence he had worn so easily earlier was starting to slip, and for the first time the jury saw him for what he really was. A man who thought his badge gave him the right to control who belonged where. Ruth didn't smile. She didn't need to. The truth had taken its first step into the light, and there was no turning back. That night, The air outside Ruth Whittaker's modest home was still, except for the faint rustling of the trees along the gravel driveway. The small porch light cast a soft glow, just enough to illuminate the worn wooden steps and the potted flowers lining the railing. It was a humble home, the kind built by hard work and held together with pride. David Ramirez parked at the curb, still replaying the video evidence in his mind. His hands were still shaking from the adrenaline of the day's revelations, but it was more than nerves now. It was the weight of responsibility, the growing sense that this case wasn't just about Ruth. It was about every person who'd ever been told to stay quiet and accept injustice. Ruth answered the door almost immediately, dressed comfortably in a navy sweatshirt and simple jeans, her hair tied back. She looked like anyone's mother, anyone's neighbor, except for that quiet, unshakable strength in her eyes. "Come on in," she said softly. David stepped inside, the house neat and simple, a crocheted throw draped over the couch, family photos along the walls, and a faint smell of apple pie still lingering from dinner. But one wall caught his eye immediately. A framed military service portrait hung above the mantel, showing a younger Ruth in crisp Air Force dress blues, her posture just as straight then as it was in the courtroom. Below it, a carefully folded American flag rested inside a glass display case, alongside rows of medals, commendations, and service ribbons. David turned to her, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "You served." Ruth gave a small smile, almost apologetic, and walked to the bookshelf. From it, she pulled a thick, leather-bound folder, worn at the edges, but treated with the care of something priceless. She set it down on the coffee table between them. 30 years, she said softly. United States Air Force. Colonel Ruth Whittaker, retired. That's the part Officer Hendricks didn't bother to ask about. David's hands hovered over the folder for a moment before opening it. Inside were training certifications, deployment orders, commendations for valor, and letters of appreciation from commanders and fellow officers. It was a record not just of service but of sacrifice, a life dedicated to defending the very freedoms that Officer Hendricks tried to strip from her on a quiet roadside. "Why didn't you tell me?" David asked, still trying to absorb it all. "Because this isn't about me being a veteran," Ruth said, her voice steady. "This is about me being a woman, a citizen, a person who had every right to stand on that sidewalk without fear. But now, it's time they know. Tomorrow, the truth wouldn't just come out, it would roar." The next morning, the air outside the Maple County Courthouse felt heavier than usual. Word had spread overnight. Whispers turned into rumors. Rumors turned into buzzing conversations at the diner, the post office, and the gas station. Everyone knew something big was coming, but no one knew exactly what. Inside, the courtroom was packed tighter than before, with some townsfolk standing along the back wall, craning their necks just to catch a glimpse. The tension was almost physical, hanging in the air like a storm that hadn't quite broken. At the defense table, Ruth sat as she always did, hands folded, back straight, gaze calm. But today, there was something different in the way she held herself, a quiet readiness, like a soldier standing at attention before stepping onto the field. "Defense may call its next witness," Judge Whitmore said, his voice low and even. David Ramirez rose. "Your Honor, the defense calls Mrs. Ruth Whittaker to the stand." A murmur rippled through the room, and as Ruth stood, she didn't rush. Each step she took was deliberate, measured, like a woman who had walked into rooms full of men who doubted her before, and knew exactly how to handle it. She took her seat, adjusted the microphone, and looked toward the jury, not with fear, but with the steady gaze of someone who had nothing left to hide. David approached, his voice clear. "Mrs. Whittaker, before we get into the events of that night, could you please tell the court a bit about your background?" Ruth folded her hands in her lap. "Certainly," she said. "My name is Ruth Ann Whittaker. I'm 58 years old, a lifelong resident of Maple County, and I've spent the last 22 years teaching middle school history at Maple County Middle School." David nodded, letting that settle for a moment. "And before that?" Ruth's hands stayed still, but her voice grew just a bit stronger. "Before that, I served for 30 years in the United States Air Force, retiring with the rank of colonel." The silence that followed was deafening. Eyes widened, jaws dropped. Even the judge's gavel, which he'd been resting against his desk, slipped slightly in his hand. A decorated Air Force colonel, right here in Maple County, sitting on trial, her service ignored, her dignity questioned. David stepped closer. "Colonel Whittaker," he said, emphasizing her rank with all that training, all that experience. "Did you ever once raise a hand to Officer Hendricks?" "No, sir," Ruth said firmly. "Because in my line of work, you learn the difference between a real threat and a man with a badge and a chip on his shoulder." The courtroom erupted, and the battle for the truth had truly begun. The silence after Ruth's revelation didn't last long. Gasps turned to hushed whispers, the kind of stunned murmur that ripples through a room when people realize they've severely misjudged someone. Even the jurors, who had tried so hard to keep neutral expressions, couldn't hide their shock. Officer Hendricks sat at the plaintiff's table, his face pale, his fingers tapping nervously on the polished wood. He wasn't smirking anymore. David Ramirez let the silence hang for just a few seconds longer before he walked back to the defense table. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, its corners slightly curled from use. "Your Honor," David said, holding the folder high enough for the jury to see. "The defense would like to submit into evidence the disciplinary record of Officer Blake Hendricks." The prosecutor, Nathan Caldwell, shot to his feet. "Objection. That record is irrelevant to the events in question." Judge Whitmore raised a hand. "Overruled. Let's see it." David stepped toward the jury box, distributing copies of the file as he spoke. "This is not the first time Officer Hendricks has found himself accused of excessive force or misconduct," David said, his voice measured, letting the words sink in. "Over the past decade, this officer has been the subject of 6 complaints, 5 of them involving black citizens. None resulted in disciplinary action." The jurors flipped through the papers, brows furrowing deeper with each page. Reports of traffic stops escalating into physical confrontations, witness statements describing Hendricks' hostile language, and internal memos noting concerns about his pattern of behavior, all buried until now. Ruth sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. She didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to say a word. David paused at the front of the jury box, looking each juror in the eye. "This case isn't just about what happened that night on the side of the road," he said. "It's about a pattern, a system that protects bad cops instead of protecting good people." He turned back toward Ruth. Mrs. Whitaker didn't resist arrest. She resisted being treated like a criminal for daring to exist where Officer Hendricks didn't think she belonged. David's voice lowered, but it carried the weight of all the years Ruth had stayed silent. She spent 30 years defending this country, only to come home and be treated like a threat, not because of anything she did, but because of what she looks like. Ruth lifted her chin slightly, her quiet strength radiating through the room. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a fight for every person Hendricks had ever targeted, silenced, or shoved aside. The jury didn't leave the room right away. They sat there, flipping through the documents David Ramirez had handed them, the weight of Ruth Whitaker's testimony still hanging heavy in the air. There was something about her, the way she carried herself, the way she spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had spent her life standing between chaos and order, that made it impossible to dismiss her. The bailiff led the jury out, and the courtroom doors swung shut behind them. The room exhaled in a collective hush, the kind of silence that only comes when everyone knows something has shifted, something that couldn't be undone. Ruth sat calmly, her hands folded, her gaze forward, not betraying a hint of nerves. This wasn't her first fight. She'd faced bigger battles, in harsher places, under skies far less forgiving. If she could withstand all of that, she could withstand this. David fidgeted with his pen, tapping it against his notepad, his knee bouncing beneath the table. "You nervous?" he whispered. Ruth smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving the courtroom doors. "I've already won," she said softly. "No matter what they decide, the truth's already out." When the jury returned, the forewoman stood, her hands steady as she held the folded piece of paper. Judge Whitmore's voice was solemn. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The room collectively held its breath. "In the case of the state of Georgia versus Ruth Whitaker, we find the defendant not guilty on all counts." The room erupted, not with chaos, but with a wave of quiet, stunned relief. Ruth's shoulders softened slightly, though her composure never broke. But the forewoman wasn't done. She cleared her throat, lifting her chin. "Additionally, Your Honor, the jury strongly recommends a full investigation into Officer Blake Hendricks' conduct, both in this case and across his career." The reaction was sharper this time. Gasps, murmurs, a low ripple of conversations breaking out all at once. Hendrick's face drained of color, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Judge Whitmore gavelled the room back to order. "This court takes that recommendation seriously," he said firmly. "Officer Hendricks, I suggest you retain counsel. This is far from over." Outside, the sunlight was warmer than it had been that morning. Ruth stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the crowd parting around her like a river making way for stone. She had stood her ground, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told to step aside. And in that moment, justice wasn't just a word. It was something you could feel in the air. In the months that followed, Officer Blake Hendricks was fired, stripped of his badge, and faced criminal charges for perjury and civil rights violations. His once loyal fellow officers quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to sync with him. Ruth Whitaker returned to her quiet life, back to her classroom full of eager students. But her story spread far beyond Maple County. Invitations poured in, veterans events, civic forums, even national interviews. But Ruth never sought the spotlight. For her, the real victory wasn't in headlines or applause. It was in proving that truth matters, dignity matters, and justice belongs to everyone, not just the powerful. Because for Ruth Whitaker, justice wasn't a moment. It was a lifelong fight, and she was ready for whatever came next. Ruth Whitaker's story may be fiction, but the reality behind it is all too familiar. Every day, ordinary people face unfair treatment, wrongful accusations, and abuses of power, not because of what they've done, but because of who they are. The lesson is clear: never judge someone by appearances, and never assume silence means weakness. Whether you're standing up for yourself or someone else, the truth is always worth fighting for. In today's world, where accountability matters more than ever, we need courage like Ruth's, the strength to demand fairness, question authority when necessary, and refuse to let lies go unchallenged. If stories like this inspire you, if you believe in justice, dignity, and standing strong in the face of adversity, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Together, we can uncover more powerful stories and lessons that remind us the fight for fairness is far from over.